Welcome to the Smarter E podcast, a podcast for and with the creators of the new energy world. Imagine a huge lake covered by floating solar panels. If you see that image in front of you, then you're looking at a floating PV power plant. Although floating PV has been around in countries such as Japan and South Korea for 10 years already, it has just really started to gather attention in regions such as Europe within the last 2 years. So high time to dive into the technical advantages of such power plants, their market potential, and the challenges that come with it. In order to tackle the topics really from all sides and to give you an in-depth engineering as well as an economic perspective on it, I have two guests today. I'll start with Minne de Jong, a researcher and project manager at the Techno Research Institute of the Netherlands, followed by some economical insights provided by Toni Weigl, a project manager for large-scale PV and also floating PV at BayWa RE. Today's episode is presented by Zimmerman PV Stahlbau. Zimmerman is a specialist for photovoltaic mounting systems. In addition to fixed-mounted and tracked ground-mounted systems, Zimmerman offers an innovative floating substructure. The developed floating PV system ZimFloat was used amongst others for the largest floating photovoltaic system in Europe with 27.5 megawatts. So, welcome, Minne.
Thanks for having us. Very, very nice to be part of this podcast.
Thanks for taking your time, Minne. I already evoked the image. So we're looking at a large lake, and then just literally like maybe a meter above the surface, you have these floating PV modules. Now, if I compare that, for example, with a offshore windmill, the solar PV seems to be really fragile compared to that. So isn't it dangerous to combine water and electricity so close together and also in such a seemingly fragile structure?
Of course, we do not intend to build anything that's dangerous. So if you want to build a solar plant and put it on the water, you need to build something that is quite different in many aspects from a land-based solar plant. So you will make sure that it is a robust design and it will not have any specific dangers.
What are the differences then really when it comes to the engineering? Like which parts have to be adjusted compared, for example, to a ground-mounted PV?
Well, there's many aspects that are different. Of course, you do not have your firm land to place your solar modules on, so you need something that floats. Obviously, you need to attach these floats together to make one plant, and then of course you need to make sure that your plant stays in place, so you will need some sort of anchoring either to the bottom of your lake or to land. And then when it comes to the environment, in some places you might have rather harsh conditions, so you have wind and you have waves, and you need to design your structure in a way that it can cope with these circumstances. And then from an electrical perspective, you need to think about the specifics of your location. So this could be humidity. It could also be a corrosive environment if you talk about salt water. So there's lots of aspects that you need to think about and engineer for.
So from an engineering perspective, if you compare it to a roof-mounted or a ground-mounted PV, it seems to be more challenging at first sight. Nevertheless, the TNO got involved in floating solar PV related research, and it seems to be worthwhile, the time spent. So from your point of view, what are like the most three attractive advantages that really justify all the research or even then the building of floating PV?
Well, I think working on the energy transition, TNO works on all aspects of that. So we have a special unit for that, which is called TNO Energy Transition. And we think that floating solar is going to be very important on a relatively short term, especially going to see maybe in a later stage. That's why we took initiative a few years ago in Europe to build up knowledge on this subject. When you talk about the advantages of floating solar compared to other types of solar, I think most importantly is double land use. And in highly inhabited areas, such as the Netherlands, but most parts of Europe for that matter, there's competition for space, you could say that. And therefore you would like to build solar farms in places that have double functionality. And I think that deploying solar parks on water could be a very good option there. So I think, the most important point here is double area use. Furthermore, you preferably generate your solar electricity where people live. And it turns out that most people live in areas where there's also a lot of water. So they either live near the coast or in fertile areas where water is abundant. And on top of that, there could be additional technical benefits. So talking about extra yield because of cooling of your modules could be important. In some places, evaporation is a large problem.
Evaporation in the sense of, for example, if you build a floating PV station on a huge, close to a huge dam, you sort of have an effective countermeasure to losing a lot of sweet water to evaporation.
Yeah, so you could talk about hydro dams where evaporation is equal to losing potential power, of course. I mean, everything that evaporates cannot go through your turbines. But another application that you could think of is deploying floating solar on top of irrigation lakes. Well, you really need that water for irrigation, so everything that's not evaporated is a bonus.
Wonderful. How big do you think is the cooling effect from the floating PV being so close to the water surface? Is there a significant difference in a PV module being installed on a rooftop versus being so close to the water body?
We as Tino have completed the first research on that we're about to publish. And you might have seen some commercial messages spread that the cooling effect can be rather spectacular, so in the order of 10 or 15%. And we have seen a significant cooling effect. So there is more energy coming out of your floating system compared to a land-mounted system, but it's not as spectacular as that. So we typically measured a few percent added output.
And I guess the warmer the region you're in, the more that effect will be, of course. South Korea and Japan have been making use of floating PV for almost a decade already. Other regions in the world are just catching on. So which countries around the world have the biggest potential for floating PV, and for what reason? I guess there's differences. It's not just about having a lake. There's other factors as well. So which regions do you think are promising when it comes to floating PV?
Well, I think if you want to have a good market for floating PV, there's three things that you need. First of all, you need a demand. So you will want to generate your power where people live or where there's more commercial activities. So it could be factories or other industry. Of course, you need water, and you need preferably have sunshine. So when you put these things together, you end up in highly inhabited countries, such as the Netherlands. I think we're nicely picking up there on this topic, but also Japan or maybe South Korea, India. And well, when you start thinking about deploying floating solar offshore, so on the sea, then there might be islands that could be a very interesting market for that. So we see that in China, there are some very large floating solar plants, so in more than 100 megawatts per system. And these are built on subsided mining areas. So that's where land has gone down due to mining activities. So you see some really large systems there. But there were some studies recently that in Germany, if you look at all the artificial, so that's man-made surface water, there would be enough space available to deploy 56 gigawatts of floating solar if you would be able to use everything. And then if you look at technical and economical potential, you could build 2.7 gigawatts there. So I think, that could be very interesting.
So some countries are already making big use of it. Other countries, as Germany, they're now catching on, and they actually have a very attractive potential for it. What are the biggest remaining challenges then for researchers such as yours, or also developers? So what will you research focus on in the coming years? What challenges do you still want to crack?
Well, we at TNO are now focusing on next steps for enabling floating PV on larger water bodies. When you look at systems that are built now, these are usually in the Netherlands. There are a lot of sand extraction lakes used for that. So these are lakes where they take out sand for building purposes, typically 20 megawatts or so. But there is large potential in larger lakes. And when you go to larger lakes, you will have different conditions. So you have more wind because you have a longer fetch. You have higher waves. And of course, this comes with challenges. So what we are doing is we're setting up a field test to do this at the Oostvoornse Lake near Rotterdam in the Netherlands. It's going to be a challenging site, and we're deploying 3 floating solar systems to measure and to work on reliability, but also perform more research on the cooling effect, but also pay attention to ecology, because I think that's a very important topic. And then talking about the steps after that is, I think, a very, very large challenge, but a very interesting one, is going to sea. So deploying floating solar offshore. And there's actually first research projects going on, and there are startup companies that work on this. Also, TNO is working on a concept for deploying floating solar at sea. And this comes with very, very, very large challenges. So if you look at the North Sea, for instance, this could be one of the places where conditions are unimaginably harsh. So this is going to be a very nice challenge. At the same time, when you're able to tackle this, if you can design something that is suited for that, the potential is enormous. There's really, almost endless amount of space offshore. And if you could use this for solar energy harvesting, this could really, really, really be a big pillar in green energy harvesting.
Of course, the challenges you're talking about are on the one hand waves, then also the salt water, working on the infrastructure. So on the one hand, probably you have a higher price tag in the development of the technology. And on the other hand, as a benefit, you have like this endless space, as you mentioned. So if you look at that and you look ahead for the coming maybe 5 or 15 years, how big will the percentage be of floating PV and its contribution to photovoltaic energy coming from photovoltaic?
I think in the near future, so in the years to come, floating PV will pick up. And in places that are suitable for that, I believe that floating PV could be a few percent of total installed PV capacity, so in the order of up to 10% or so. But if we are really able to deploy offshore floating solar, I think the potential is so large that in some countries, this really become one of the pillars of clean energy generation.
That sounds very promising. Speaking about become really one of the major pillars, seeing that some countries already have a long history of dealing with floating PV, are there some best practices that regions who are just now catching up really should pay attention to?
When you talk about volume, I think the main countries to look at are China and Japan. These are really well ahead, and they've shown that PV is possible, and they have also paved the way in terms of taking risk and enabling development of floating PV. At the same time, we've also seen some occasions where things do not quite go as planned. So we have some examples of damages to a floating power plant in Japan. And this also shows us that, quality is very important. And it's important to see that every project has its own requirements. So every lake is different. Every climate is different. Circumstances can be different. So it needs, every location, every plant needs its own engineering in terms of the float itself, the system itself, but also the anchoring.
So I think the example you talked about in Japan was a whole floating PV being destroyed by a hurricane. And I guess that's your point, that it's really worthwhile investing into good quality when it comes to the mooring, the anchoring, into the connection parts. Because if you are in a hurricane region, obviously you need your floating PV to be able to withstand a hurricane. And then if you're in another region, you might have to deal with other challenges. So in that regard, there doesn't seem to be one blueprint that you can just roll out globally. Thanks so much for taking your time, Minne, and for sharing your engineering perspective with us.
Thank you very much.
In order to complete it and have a 360-degree perspective on the topic, we'll now move on and I'll talk to Toni Weigl of BayWa RE. So just to give our listeners some context, BayWa RE is a leading global renewable energy developer, also service supplier, distributor, and energy solutions provider. They have more than 1.6 gigawatt of PV already installed worldwide. And when it comes specifically to floating PV, they are basically one of or the leading player in, for example, Europe. So Toni, welcome to our podcast.
Hey, welcome. Thanks for having me.
So maybe from your perspective, tell me, you're one of the leading players in Europe, as I just mentioned. So when it comes to floating PV, what have you done already to get there? And what kind of role does it play in your overall PV mix at BayWa RE?
Well, yes, you just said BayWa already built 1.6 gigawatt of ground-mounted parks. Their floating was a very small part because we just started with floating PV in 2018. There we did first some market research, how to enter the market. And then in December 2018, built our first pilot project of 2.1 megawatt peak, just before Christmas in December. And last year, we added another 2 floating projects, which were quite significantly bigger already. And there we continued to improve the system significantly in many details and also reduced the costs quite significantly. This constant improvement also in our construction sequences enabled us then, beginning of this year, to build another project of Baumhofsplatz with 27.4 megawatt in just 7 weeks. There we installed up to 1 megawatt peak per day on the site. Besides that very quick and efficient installation, that is now also the biggest floating PV park outside of China. So with these 4 plants of more than 50 megawatt installed in floating PV, we consider ourselves to be one of the biggest players of floating PV in Europe. And we think that this share of floating PV within BayWa will also increase in the next years, as we see a huge potential, not only in Europe, but all over the world for floating PV.
So you just joined basically 2 or 2.5 years ago, and you've seen a fast acceleration of your activities in that field. When you entered the market, were you able to simply source the floating structure, for example, from other market players, I don't know, from producers in China or Japan? Or did you have to build your own system?
Yeah, initially that was the idea, to just source it from the market and use what was implemented already in Asia. But after studying the market and really testing these systems in the different installations, we figured out that these systems, which are available now, did not meet our high standards in terms of quality, reliability, and also the environmental impact, which we want to be associated with our name. Therefore, we invested quite some resources in developing an own floating PV system together with Zimmerman Stahlbau, which is an expert in PV substructures, and really sought it from the complete system design and not just making one PV panel float, but see how we can put an efficient power plant on a lake, which can be also operated and maintained for 25 years. Therefore, we designed a very stable system with strong anchoring, so there's also no risks to be seen in the future, and making it easy for our operation and maintenance colleagues to maintain the system. Because in the end, for us, the most important is to be able to comfortably provide efficient and reliable PV power plants to our investors, which want to operate it for the long term.
Investors being an important keyword here, because quite a lot of our participants and visitors of other formats, for example, the Smarter E-exhibitions, are actually investors. So at what point, you mentioned it, it's a very dynamic market that's developing fast. So where are we at with floating PV? Is it already an interesting investment for investors, also compared with the other forms of PV?
Yeah, I definitely think so. There's a huge appetite from investors for floating PV. Just last week, we sold the 4th project, Baumhofsplatz, to a local investor, but there was also high competition on that project. So the investors are really look for good and secure opportunities to invest their money, and that's also given with floating PV. I mean, in the end, we are using the same components as in the ground-mounted parks. We provide the same documentation and also the same guarantees. So there is not really an extra risk to be considered when investing in floating PV. We always say in the end, floating PV is just a new application of proven components and not a new technology. So investors are already familiar with that as well.
I just found it really interesting that you said there was a lot of competition. And were you talking about competition amongst the investors or competition amongst the developers getting this specific project going?
No, amongst the investors. We always build a complete project, get all the permits and all the components together, and then sell the project only once it's completely operating and injecting the electricity to the grid. So there, the investors are really looking for these very low-risk investments.
So I think that's a good sign, then also looking forward for the future capacities being installed. If there's a high interest of investors, that means there's enough money in the market to also give the market a boost.
Yeah, for sure. We are expecting that floating PV will rise up very quickly.
Let's go a little bit more in the specifics there. Then what is your prediction for the development of the LCOE?
Well, LCOE, of course, is the most important thing in the end for the investors as well. So right now, if we look at the floating PV systems, comparing them to the ground-mounted systems, the installation costs or the capex costs are, of course, still a bit higher. But on the operational side, there is quite some money to be saved. One on the land lease costs, which are lower for these unused border bodies compared to high-value agricultural land. And also we see lower operation and maintenance costs. So in the end, the LCOEs are already quite similar, and it's not much more expensive electricity coming from floating compared to ground-mounted systems. I think in the next years, the prices will drop further, both in the CapEx and also in the OpEx. So we will get to very similar LCOE prices and then also reach grid parity with floating PV.
With Minne, previously I already talked a little bit about the engineering challenges. What are the challenges from an investor's point of view? For example, do you sometimes run into problems with local acceptance, like with the local communities having to give away maybe their bathing lake to a power plant?
Yeah, I think you just mentioned two different points. One is the investor. So of course, investors are asking more questions because they are more used to the ground-mounted projects. So investing in the younger brother, as we call it, floating PV, is of course raising some extra questions, but these can be asked quite easily. And then the other point regarding the local acceptance, of course, if we would take the water bodies where they were basing before, that would create huge problems. But we see a huge potential for unused water bodies. So we don't see the need to use lakes where we might have issues with local acceptance. There are many sand and gravel extraction lakes, flooded coal mines and reservoirs, which can be used for floating PV, where like normal people don't even know about them or it's forbidden to enter anyways. So we don't see a big problem there with the local acceptance. But I want to highlight again that we are not using any bathing lakes or lakes with other activities like swimming, diving or sailing or something else.
And that probably is also like a best practice advice then. If you want a smooth development for your project, it's best to just look for areas that don't have another use except maybe being used for irrigation or for a hydropower plant. All right, maybe as a last question, I already mentioned you're the market leader in Europe. So if we expand, there are a few from Europe all around the world. Which do you think are the most dynamic markets from a developer or investor's perspective when it comes to floating PV?
Well, I think we started in the Netherlands because we had there very good economical conditions for floating PV. But as I said before, we think that we will reach grid parity in several markets. Of course, in the southern European markets, that will happen first. So we are heavily focusing now on Spain, France, also Germany, but also look at Italy and Greece, for example. But I think on the long term, none of the countries or markets will get around floating PV. So we'll also see a further boom in Asia and a new boom also in the United States and Africa, I think, in the future. So there we want to be present in all these markets. Yeah, what really drives us here is the potential which we see for the world, which was communicated by the World Bank lately, which was about 400 gigawatt of floating PV could be installed if only 1% of the man-made sweetwater reservoirs would be used. So that's a huge potential worldwide, but also broken down to Europe. That means about 20 gigawatt for Europe if we just use 1% of the man-made sweetwater reservoirs. And if you would use up to 10%, which is also quite a little, we could get up to 200 gigawatt of floating PV within Europe.
Thanks a lot, Toni. Those are really exciting numbers. And then also considering we've just been talking about sweetwater reservoirs. And as Minne said before, they're still trying to crack also the possibility of installing floating PV on the open ocean. So in a saltwater environment with big waves. And I think once that challenge has been tackled, then really there is an enormous potential for floating PV.
Stay tuned for more episodes of the Smarter E podcast.
If you're looking for more information on current trends and innovations in the solar sector, then visit Intersolar Europe, the world's leading exhibition for the solar industry. Online at intersolar.de/en. And if you're looking for global events of the new energy world, then please visit thesmartere.com.